administration who can call the editor of the New York Times, the political director of CNN, and say, I know it looks like A happened, but it didn't. And you just have to trust me on that. The story is not true the way you think it looks. Trust me on this. And you get to do that one time and if you break that one time, you never get to do it again. And one of the things I'm sort of stunned about by Sean Spicer is they threw that away. One of the things that was striking to me about the president's press conference today was there's just the journalists are just giving him these looks like, you again? Really? Really? I'm supposed, and they burned through that heat shield that surrounds presidents.
So the next three questions I want to ask you: best case scenario, what scares you most, and what we can do to mitigate what scares you most. So, best case scenario. So my dad's in the audience, and he's like, "What's the big deal? The stock market's up. We haven't gone to war with anyone yet." You say at the beginning of the piece, you could actually imagine that because of the deregulation of business, tax cuts, an infrastructure program that actually provides a Keynesian boost to the economy while actually shoring up our infrastructure. 4 years from now, 8 years from now, the economy might be looking pretty. I mean, is there? I mean, I don't believe a word I'm saying. Yeah. Well, but is there a way where this could all work out, or that somehow the average of all their crazy sort of cross-cutting things averages out to be, well, you know.
Well, economically, I'm a lot more optimistic about if he were to have an 8-year term, because in the 4-year term, the stimulus will have its effect without generating inflation, without generating economic dislocations, and the corruption the costs of corruption and favoritism will not be too. I mean, you all saw the story today, I think, about how the president had the head of Lockheed on the phone, and he had the head of Boeing on the phone, unbeknownst to the head of Lockheed. And you think, that is a weird story, but there's no good explanation for why that could have happened. So I don't know I haven't figured out what the angle is, but there's an angle there. So here's the optimistic scenario, and then here's the scary scenario. The optimistic scenario is not that the Trump administration is okay. It's not going to be okay. The optimistic scenario is that there is a level of civic mobilization that we have not seen for a long time. I think the group that I keep recommending to people as the model of the most successful activist movement of my lifetime is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which is a group with an extremely focused agenda, very broad membership. They didn't care what you thought about guns or abortion or taxes. You didn't even have to be a mother. But you thought we should have tougher enforcement against the rules of drunk driving. Come on to the meeting and then go argue with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, because it's a pretty positive group on the one side and a pretty negative group on the other. And they have the transformation. The older people will remember the most popular comedy show on American television in the late 1960s, the Dean Martin Show. Its #1 theme for jokes was the hilarity of having too much to drink and driving home. And that was something that you watched on, what was it, Saturday night, and people thought it was hilarious. And I mean, that is like a joke you could not even contemplate. You'd be thrown out of the writer's room if you thought about it. You just couldn't. And indeed, highway fatalities are down in an amazing way. And they continued, and we've had not many technical improvements to cars since the middle 1980s. It is so groups like that organize and demand laws that the president releases tax return, demand an independent investigation of the Russia connection. And the president is just sort of hemmed in. And he decides golf and TV are really going to be his 2 top priorities for the rest of his administration. and then you get sort of normal governance. And, probably the more liberal people in the audience wouldn't like what then happens. The more conservative people can live with it. And then you sort of get through the presidency. That's the most optimistic scenario. But it's very easy to imagine some really scary things happen. Let me just point to 2, because we haven't talked much about foreign affairs, but the scariest things do involve issues of war and peace. And here are the 2 that I think bear worrying about. The first is the relationship with China. Trump and his people have been steering to confrontation with China, having first alienated all of America's allies in the Pacific. They tear up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which bears very heavily on countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, the poor members of the Contain China coalition. And they had this, we don't know whether he literally yelled at the Prime Minister of Australia, but I noticed today when the president listed all the positive phone calls he had, he did not mention Australia. He was not at pains to say, that was a better phone call than everybody else told you it was. And that's America's most militarily capable ally in the region. So you're steering toward a confrontation with China with no friends. And that can only end badly. But the most frightening thing, and it goes back to the Russians, we have an American armored brigade has just in the past few weeks been deployed in Poland. There are British and French troops moving into Estonia, Canadians in Latvia, Germans in Lithuania. Britain and France, of course, are also nuclear powers. The Russians have had this huge arms buildup and are behaving in increasingly aggressive and provocative ways. And they think or I shouldn't say they think, I don't know what they think, but it is possible that they think that they have somebody in the White House who owes them and who will yield to them. And they may miscalculate how I would say that the second worst thing you can do is what President Obama did in Syria, which is draw a red line and not enforce it. But the worst thing you can do is have a red line that people don't know about, because then they trip the red line and then terrible things happen. So those are some of the worst things. Another terrible thing that could happen is that third thing, that in Donald Trump's attacks on the intelligence services in order to protect himself, he disables the country's defenses against terrorism. And while he is barring from the country the head of the German-American Friendship Group in the Bundestag, which he literally did because the person was born in Iran, that other people who do not come from the 7 countries on the list are able to continue to come into the country, and we have so disabled the security services that we are less well protected than we have been in the past few years.
So you wrote in the original piece, and I think you wrote again yesterday, that what stands the most potent bulwark against the worst of Trump's excesses are Republicans in Congress.
Yeah. Not the most potent, but the most proximate.
The most proximate.
They haven't been very potent.
Well, no. Well, they haven't been potent at all, and that's one of the questions. In fact, I'm trying to find the original quote here. Congress can protect the American system from an overbearing president, but will it? It hasn't. You called them out about this yesterday. Do you think they will? And if not now, what will it take? What's the tipping point where they actually would do that?
Well, it takes us. I mean, that there's a big difference in the Republicans in the Senate and the House. So the Senate is just full of people who would like to be Brutus and Cassius to Trump's Julius Caesar. They would love it. And I think in a few cases, like John McCain, I don't think I'm speaking metaphorically here.
A2 McCain.
Yeah, I think they would really, just like a slow, or maybe just call them and make people run up legal bills and slowly torture them in front of congressional. But so there are people in the Senate who would like to do it, but there's a collective action problem. You need enough of them. And in the House, there's ideology. But here's what is stopping them. So John Kasich was the last man standing in the Republican Party running against Donald Trump, and Rob Portman, also senator from Ohio, who ran much better in the state, was obviously very unenthralled by Donald Trump. So some of us thought that the Ohio State Republican Party would be the real bulwark of internal opposition to Donald Trump. In January, the chairman of the Ohio Republican Party comes up for re-election. It's a man named Matt Borges, a very effective chairman, good fundraiser, close to Kasich. There had been a story about him, he'd been very skeptical about Trump. There was a story about him in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. He and his wife were watching the TV, and his wife had not voted for Trump, and and Borges was agonizing about his vote. But the thought was Borges would be reelected, and the Ohio party would become this force. And Trump got the same thought. So this president who doesn't have time to read his presidential daily intelligence brief, began making calls to members of the Ohio State Party Committee. And he made enough calls to enough Ohio State, I don't know, it's 20 people. I don't know how many are on the committee. I should know that. But he made enough calls to flip the vote and to defeat Borges and to promote instead a Trump loyalist who had not been much of a fundraiser, not been much of a president of the party, not generally well-liked, but because beholden to the president, he was able to put pressure. And that sent a message to every statewide office holder in the Republican Party. If he can reach into John Kasich's state and John Kasich has really high approval numbers. John Kasich state and take away Kasich's party from Governor Kasich, he can do it to you in almost any state in the country. And that's the restraint. So they need an equal and opposite force, both good of fear and hope, from voters in their states. And that requires a mobilized public opinion.
I'm going to ask you to indulge in an imaginative exercise here. You're Paul Ryan. You're poised to finally enact what you've been stymied on since 2006. Tax cuts, rolling back Obamacare, if you can figure out what to replace it with, all kinds of other things. And yet, you're dealing with, let's not call him the devil, but you're dealing with Trump.
Yeah.
What is your political calculus, and how far do you go to finally realize your policy ambitions?